Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're going to continue on to Unit 4, discussing political organizations of space. Now in the previous video we were talking about American electoral geography, and we were talking about congressional districts, electoral college, things along those lines. And today what we're going to do is we're just going to do a very brief overview of voting in the United States, and basically just kind of looking at a brief timeline of who was able to vote in the United States. And of course this relates really nicely to the last video, because if we're talking about representation, we're talking about representative republics or representative democracies, things along those lines, which most of the countries in the world today have some form of representative government. Then it's important to remember that the representation is going to be based upon the voting public. And so when we talk about these types of governments, and we talk about these countries that have these systems and laws and things, and the types of laws they put in place, and really kind of the values and the ethics that are portrayed through the government, it should be, and it's supposed to be, a representation of the people. And then of course you kind of narrow that down even further and you say, well, it's the voting public, which is why when we talk about, if you listen to the news or anything like that, and we talk about voter turnout and things like that, when we hear about 30-40% voter turnout, typically even lower than that, then it gets to be it's kind of an interesting situation and conversation, because really what you're looking at is representation that's based upon not even a very large majority of the people who are able to vote in the United States. And so as we go through each of these events, it's important to remember how is it that as you add new types of people to the voting, how that's going to change representation, how that's going to change don't necessarily want to say ethics, but maybe the desires of people, or the different agendas that people have, or the different goals that people have for the country, for society, and things along those lines. And of course, not only how are the laws going to reflect that, but also think about the types of representatives that we're going to have in terms of ethnicities, different ethnicities gaining representation in the form of a representative, or genders, talking about female representatives and all of that, female justices and things, and people working within levels of government, as a reflection of the new voting population. Because when we talk about new people coming in to vote, the representatives in the government are going to want to reflect the desires of those people, so they can get the votes that they need in order to get elected, or to stay in office, and those types of things. So those are all important things to remember kind of as we go through this very brief timeline. And this obviously isn't going to be all inclusive. It's just kind of give you an idea of who was or was not able to vote in the United States in given historic periods. Of course, independence, War for Independence started in 1776, and so once the country gained its independence, and this is fairly typical for any type of country that had any form of voting in any country across the world. If you look back to the ancient times, even when the Greeks and the Romans had voting, democracy, representation, whatever it was always land-owning citizens of that particular country. So if you look at Rome, you had to be a Roman citizen. If you were Greek, you had to be a Greek citizen. And typically that meant you had to be born as a Greek or born as a Roman. Now as Rome went on, you could gain citizenship. We're not here to talk about that. It's just something important to keep in mind as we go through history. So anyway, when we talk about the initial independence of the United States, the only people who could vote were going to be those who were white men who owned property, and you had to be 21 or older. Property ownership, obviously kind of an indication of the values of the time. During this particular time period, late 1700s, early 1800s, land was still kind of the symbol of status and symbol of wealth, more so than the amount of actual physical money that you had. In fact, in a lot of cases, people were almost bankers, investors, and things like that. A lot of times were looked down on, because they were seen almost as greedy money grubbers, things along those lines. But anyway, property ownership was going to be the big key there. And then you'll see that between 1807 to 1843, it moves to a situation where all white men who are 21 and older are able to vote. And so you kind of have a progressive getting rid of the property requirement. And so you think about what that's going to do in terms of opening it up to representation to people of all social status. Initially, you have a situation where only people of very high social status are going to be able to vote, and then through the 1800s, you're going to bring in people of all levels of social status, from the wealthiest to the poorest, and a lot of that you also tie into education and things, which is what the early founders and things of the country were concerned about, was people who were uneducated, people who were not familiar with the topics of the day or the issues of the day going in to vote. And so that's why a lot of times they wanted to keep out certain segments of the population from voting. And people will make arguments other than that, but we're not here to get into those discussions. But anyway, moving on. In 1870, you had the 15th Amendment passed, where all men who are 21 and older can vote. And this, of course, is post-Civil War, and so we have the North winning the Civil War, and so the 15th Amendment is passed to try and bring in the black population of the United States. And really, Americans had to that point discriminated against large numbers of minority ethnic groups, not just Africans, and then the slaves who were descendants of Africans. And so the attempt there is to get rid of racial or ethnic discrimination in voting. And then we move on, and then the next big jump is going to be in the 1920s, when you have the 19th Amendment passed, which is all women who are 21 and over are able to vote. And so you not only have gotten over the racial barrier, but then also the gender barrier. And I always think it's interesting that legally we got over the racial barrier before we got over the gender barrier. But anyhow, so of course, adding in the new demographic of women is going to be a huge move in terms of the types of laws that are being passed, the representation that's going to be in the Congress and in the presidency, and then also not only that, but also the local levels and the state levels, things along those lines. In 1964, you have the 24th Amendment passed, which is pretty much what was going on in the South. Is you had the Jim Crow South, where the South, even though you weren't allowed to discriminate based upon race or ethnicity, race or ethnicity, they were the South was trying to keep the black population from voting for using a variety of different tactics. One of those was poll taxes. Basically, you had to go in and pay a fee in order to vote. And so this not only going to keep out the poor black population, but also keep out the poorer segments, really the poor segment of the population just in general. And in 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, and similar thing. You're trying to get rid of any roadblock that's going to keep any group of people from voting. So any type of artificial barrier. So in this case, you're looking at things like literacy tests, which people would have to go in and basically write statements or things along those lines in order to vote. Grandfather clauses. With the grandfather clause, it was if your grandfather wasn't allowed to vote, then you're not allowed to vote, and kind of so forth and so on. But again, it was just another form of roadblock to try and keep certain people out from voting. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 tries to do away with those particular roadblocks. And that's a lot of the conversation we're having today with voter IDs and things like that. And people are making the comment that requiring some form of identification is just another way to keep a roadblock for people, keep people from voting. Those who are for voter ID simply say that they are trying to keep the integrity of the election system, to make sure that the people who are voting are who they say they are, because there are elements of voter fraud, things along those lines. Again, not necessarily a discussion for today, but still part of the conversation in our world in the year 2000. Well, I guess it's 2015. Happy New Year to everyone, by the way. And then 1971, you have the 26th Amendment, where the voting age is lowered to 18. Kind of the concept, you had the Vietnam War had been going on, The idea was that, well, if you could be drafted at 18, well, why wouldn't you be able to vote? If they're going to send you to die, you should be able to at least cast your ballot to vote for representatives, things along those lines. And so that's going to be a major shift because now you're looking at a younger age of the population. Now, when we talk about the voting population, again, people who are the people who are going to be going out and voting, that's of utmost importance to the representatives because they want to make sure that they are the groups of people who are voting they're keeping happy so they can stay in their office. And of course, the youngest population tends to be the ones who vote the least, where the elderly population is the ones who tend to vote the most. And so this is where demographics really kind of comes into play. And that's why we have some of the difficult conversations with things along Social Security and other forms of government assistance, because with the elderly getting a kind of a large proportion of that government assistance, it's going to be very difficult to make any modifications to those systems without upsetting the elderly. And of course, because the young population is such a small percentage of the voting base, then really their concerns there are not really a concern for representatives. So that's all that we're going to talk about for today. At least that's all we have time for today in terms of a brief timeline of voting in the United States. I hope you found that helpful. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments, and I hope to see you soon.